So next up, we have Dr. Adam Back, CEO of Blockstream, and Stacy Herbert. And they are going to have a fireside chat to talk about the origins of Bitcoin. Dun, dun, dun.
So, if anybody in the audience has actually read the Bitcoin white paper, then Adam Back should need no introduction. But in case he does, he's the inventor of Hashcash, referenced in the white paper, and the co-founder and CEO of Blockstream. Adam, Wikipedia describes you first as a British businessman, which to me kind of conjured up images of wearing a bowler hat and driving a Bentley. But it then goes on to describe you as a cypherpunk cryptographer and a pioneer in digital asset research, which is what I want to talk to you about today. I want to find out why Bitcoin happened. First of all, are you able to talk? Can the audience hear you?
He's backstage again. I think he crashed.
No, there are two Adam Backs.
I see him on.
Okay. He says his laptop is
on stage.
Going crazy. Yeah, he says, yeah, he can't hear you. His laptop is going crazy.
I want to find out why Bitcoin happened. So let's go over what the cypherpunks, what they were about, what they were trying to do when they were creating the predecessors to Bitcoin. If the space program was trying to get man to the moon, what were you cypherpunks trying to do by inventing things like Hashcash and B-Money and BitGold? So let's start with Hashcash as it's referenced in the white paper, and then we'll work back from there. So what did you want to do with Hashcash? What were you trying to do and achieve with it?
But let me try to answer your question. So Hashcash, I believe it was an anti-spam measure originally. It was meant to be like a postage stamp, but instead of paying for postage, you have to perform a calculation on your computer in order to send an email. But that was the initial purpose. So proof of work, you work or expend some effort to do something to show that you're not a spammer, and you have this cryptographic postage stamp. So that was the origin of Hashcash. I think Adam used to say Bitcoin is Hashcash extended with inflation control, and that's pretty accurate because if you think about it, it kind of is. If you put a limit on it, then you kind of have Bitcoin.
Huh, Hashcash with inflation control. That's interesting. I'm going to write that down. And, but, so, because this came out of the whole cypherpunk movement, we have to talk about what the cypherpunks were. And then I want to move to actual privacy and what the role of privacy was in their battle against the government, essentially. I mean, this whole thing started in 1985 when David Chaum wrote Security Without Identification Transaction Systems to Make Big Brother Obsolete. So there was kind of like a political endeavor behind it around privacy and around, securing privacy from Big Brother and the government. So tell us, first of all, Samson, how you see the cypherpunks. They were founded in 1992. Who were they? What were they? And then, let's talk about their ethos embedded in Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's a good Adam question. I can only give my impression of it. I think it was a fight for privacy. And I believe back then, the tools to enable privacy were not as robust as what we have today. Today we have Signal, wire messaging. We have okay encrypted mainstream platforms like WhatsApp. I'm pretty sure they're pretty weak encryption, or there's a backdoor or two in there, but it's better than nothing. iMessage is decent, but back then it was unsure if privacy was okay or allowed. And I remember, I think PGP, even people working on PGP and stuff like that, they weren't sure if they're going to get rounded up by the government. And I believe that there was also a ban on exporting cryptography or anything that could help with privacy. So one famous thing that Adam did was he put I forget what he put. He put something on a T-shirt, and he sold these T-shirts. I think with some code on them, and that technically
it was actual PGP code.
Yeah, it was okay. It was actual PGP code. So it's actually in. Yeah. It was contraband. Basically, it's illegal to export, and he was selling these T-shirts on the internet. So Adam's quite a badass.
Yeah, well, they were doing battle with the U.S. government. So, I mean, when Adam comes on, we could talk to him about that. So there, you know, in terms of privacy and this panopticon that these early cypherpunks were warning about, you know, there is a thing called Zimmerman's law, which states that the natural flow of technology tends to move in the direction of making surveillance easier, and the ability of computers to track us doubles every year. So I wanted to ask him, you know, of course, that was Philip Zimmerman who created PGP. And I believe he was the one threatened with arrest for releasing the code. But does Bitcoin fix this? What do you think, Samson? Do you think Bitcoin fixes the privacy issue?
Well, it's interesting. There are parallels here. I believe it just happens because systems tend towards centralization, and when systems tend towards centralization, it makes it easier for companies or governments to surveil. So if you look at things like the chat apps and the tools that we have to communicate, you know, they rely on network effects. You need to have you want to use the platform that everyone is using. So if you're in China, you're using WeChat. And if you're in Japan, you're using Line. I think Taiwan also uses Line a lot. Yeah, I think in North America, it's kind of mixed, but I think WhatsApp dominates a fair amount of the mainstream. Yeah. We're all using Signal and Wire, but they're still using WhatsApp. But you know, you want to use what everyone's on, and that gives those entity platforms a lot of control over you. So it does help with surveillance. And we kind of have parallels in Bitcoin.
Hey, Adam's back.
Oh, Adam's back. Adam is back. Yes, we hear you.
Yes.
Amazing.
Hey.
Okay.
I'll finish my thought. So, like, Bitcoin also tends towards centralization through pooled mining, and just because it is industrial now, you have big companies that need to mine, and that does give power to entities. Like at one time, Bitmain was very powerful because they made the hardware, they hosted the hardware, and they ran the pools, and that gave them that made them a threat to Bitcoin existentially. So, anyways, I'll leave now and let you continue with Adam.
Well, thanks for stepping in because technical issues here.
Oh, that's okay. You look great in this virtual world, Adam. It's good to have you here. You know, basically, let's move back to some of the answers that Samson wasn't able to give. So, Bitcoin, basically, we're trying to determine whether it was an industrial accident or if there was some sort of evolutionary impulse. Like if you look at the history, you know, some might think like Bitcoin just erupted out of thin air and it was a virginal birth. But if you look back, you know, you do see Hashcash, you see B-Money, you see BitGold, eCash, like there were all these other cryptocurrencies, we might call them. And like, so what exactly were you guys were all pretty much cypherpunks creating these? Like, what was the intent behind it? Like, what was this drive that you were aiming for? Like, what were you aiming for, and how might that inform us about the origins of Bitcoin?
Well, I mean, I guess we don't know for sure if Satoshi was, you know, on the cypherpunks list, for example, but certainly the cypherpunks were pretty interested in finding a way to get decentralized electronic cash. So, or just to have electronic cash that was permissionless. That was the key property people were interested in. And we realized the hard way that it had private but central server electronic cash system. So it had like, you know, a high degree of privacy, but centralization issues. And so its demise was basically the company operating it ran out of business, and also some indications that the central bank in the Netherlands, where they're operating, may not have been too happy with them, and so there would have been also a policy risk if it had gone further. And so people started to think that the solution should be decentralized. And so I think Aaron van Woerden, from time to time, looks through some of the old cypherpunks lists and digs up some interesting things. So you can see, some of the thought processes of people trying to figure out how to make this work. And so, the general idea was to make technology that would regain control and privacy for the individual, as opposed to the establishment or the state, just as a recognition that a lot of rights have been kind of de facto lost due to the characteristics of online technology. And electronic cash was, arguably the most interesting and important one of those kind of technologies. So I think there was a lot of, focused intent to try and create an electronic cash system. And the idea of using proof of work and mining to do that goes back to, let's say, early 1997 at least. And then there were all the different kind of early designs, like 1998, Wei Dai's B-Money, and Nick Saba's BitGold, and later in 2004, Hal Finney's RPow. RPow wasn't decentralized, but it had some clever use of tamper-resistant hardware to achieve an effect. So I think it's a bit hard to tell, because some of these things weren't really papers. They were just people discussing and trying to figure out how to do things. But it seems like I might have been the first person to suggest using proof of work, basically, to mine to create the coins to get around because the previous systems had the assumption that you would need to partner with a bank to get value into the system. And so there's a March 97 thread with a fellow called Robert Hettinger, who used to organize some physical meetups in one of the cypherpunks in the cypherpunk area. And in that discussion thread, basically, if you read it, and maybe we can tweet it out later, it looks like Hettinger is saying some limitations or some issues, and I'm saying, well, why don't we try using proof of work to get around the need for any kind of banking relationship to make it work, and let the secondary market sort it out, and people can get in ultimately by mining. So there are obviously lots of technical challenges that didn't get solved well until Satoshi solved a couple more issues with the Bitcoin design. But you can see, going back to at least that far, the interest and intent to create a mined and decentralized cryptocurrency.
So, I mean, a lot of the cypherpunks were cryptographers or coders, and so they understood this new internet world that, it was still new back then, the internet. So they understood the whole panopticon nature of it, but they also understood the need for a censorship resistant, native currency. But so the first sentence of the Bitcoin white paper does refer to this, that Bitcoin doesn't need a trusted third party like financial institutions. So are you saying like there were, like that was like the example of eCash and the need for banks in that system? Like did you learn from that, or was it just that you wanted more privacy? Like it wasn't enough privacy to have to use the legacy banking system and the KYC and AML and all that sort of stuff?
Well, I mean, yeah, so I'm sure the KYC would have been a problem. And as I hinted, the rumor is that DigiCash itself had some run-in with the regulator. So I'm sure that would have arisen. I mean, the initial challenge was people wanted to find a way to bootstrap it and have it work. And so, even having it work in a central server with bank integration would have at least had a running system, but people could see that, I mean, the fact that that system, the DigiCash system, failed due to business continuity, like the company went under, and also there were some rumors that the regulator was not happy with them for doing it, suggested that you needed a decentralized system to have something that was like long-term survivable. And that's what Bitcoin brought, amongst other things, some technical solutions and the decentralized way to make it all work. So B-Money and BitGold were like reasonably close, but had some sort of design gaps, I guess, where it wasn't quite implementable, or if it had been implemented as is, it would have had some centralization that Bitcoin finds ways to work around. For example, the difficulty adjustment is one of the insights in Bitcoin that was absent from those systems, from those designs.
Right. But let's talk about the role, because when I look back at this period prior to Bitcoin, and it's mostly in the 1990s, but some of it is in the 1980s, privacy, this issue of privacy really seems to be central to all the conversation happening there. And it was quite confrontational. I don't think people realize that nowadays, but the whole, the fact that cryptography was, considered munitions by the U.S. Department of Defense added to this basically rebel spirit. In fact, they were code rebels, right? So
yep.
This issue of privacy seems so important to the evolutionary origins of Bitcoin. In 1985, David Chaum wrote Security Without Identification, Transaction Systems to Make Big Brother Obsolete. So that was in his thinking behind, the work he was doing. Then the cypherpunks, i.e. the code rebels, they were founded in 1992. And Eric Hughes in 1993 wrote Cypherpunks Write Code. We know that someone has to write software to defend privacy. We're going to write it. So is the Bitcoin protocol, does that help achieve any privacy? Has it fallen down? Like, where do you find, what do you think about that, the role of privacy in Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, I think financial privacy is important. And so Bitcoin has some side effects because it was able to solve the sort of decentralization problem that DigiCash system ultimately failed over, I think. It becomes publicly auditable and very transparent, or transparent. You can see all of the transactions, but they're sort of pseudonymous. They've got some kind of best effort privacy. And so in some ways, Bitcoin has worse privacy than previous systems, but clearly privacy is important because even in today's banking world, you have at least privacy versus the world at large, right? So they're not tank tracing companies, or just individuals can look up some addresses and try and piece things together. So that kind of privacy is sort of a step backwards in a way. But I think Bitcoin did a better job at solving the decentralized system robust in the event of any given company or part of the decentralized system leaving the market, like a miner going bankrupt or a transaction processor in exchange. Anybody could go and leave, and the system will continue, and there's a financial incentive for it to continue. So it's very robust. So I think that was looking at it from the point of view of somebody who was familiar with those previous electronic cash systems. And then I implemented the DigiCash protocol and a more recent one by Stefan Brands in a crypto library in the 90s. And if you look at that compared to Bitcoin, it has very strong, those things have very strong privacy. So I think, when people were looking at how to design an electronic cash system, they had that idealized mindset that it should have this cryptographic unlinkability, i.e. if you receive a coin, you shouldn't be able to tell where it came from. Somebody looking at it from the outside shouldn't be able to tell which coins are going to which user. If there's a service provider, they shouldn't be able to tell, between the payer and the payee if those coins are related or not. And so the block explorer effect, where you can see coins going from address 1 to address 2, would be missing in those protocols because of blinding or something like that, right? So that was the assumption. So when Bitcoin was released, people who were familiar with those protocols were looking at it and thinking, well, it solved decentralization problems that should be more robust, but it the privacy is kind of best effort or weakened. And we know why that is, because it's harder to do cryptographic blinding in a distributed system. And actually, there was a protocol to do it, which was published in 1999, called Auditable Anonymous Electronic Cash by Sandra and Tashma. And so that's one of my first observations, is, oh, Bitcoin doesn't use that. But in fairness, that is a relatively CPU-heavy protocol, and is actually cited in some of the in the Zero Coin paper, which is an academic paper by Matthew Green and others. So I had the same idea that they came to a few years later, that, oh, well, Bitcoin could have used that, but it's quite CPU heavy. So we'll see, Bitcoin adds more incremental privacy over time, and there are layer 2 things that can provide privacy, such as confidential transactions, which was something I proposed in 2013 to hide another part of the privacy picture, sort of the balance of an address. But yeah, I think for financial privacy is important, and that's an area where Bitcoin has some work to do.
Right, and of course, the censorship-resistant nature of it is proving. I don't know if it was as important back then, but definitely today in 2020, you see, entire nations across Africa who are using Bitcoin because, not through sanctions or anything, but just because of KYC, AML, and also the size of their economies. They're not part of the U.S. Based banking system grid, so they don't have access to it. So, then there's the sanctioned nations like Venezuela and Iran, who are, their citizens are able to circumvent sanctions through using Bitcoin. But I want to ask one thing about somebody who's become a hero in the space, and that's Hal Finney. He received the first ever Bitcoin transaction. So for those of new to this space, or who might not know the history, what role did Hal Finney play in the development of Bitcoin? Like, what was his role with his relationship with Satoshi like, and what do you think he added? What were his contributions to the origins of Bitcoin?
Hal Finney is a pretty prolific coder. So, and somebody, when people say cypherpunks write code, that's quite well personified by Hal Finney, because he wrote lots of different pieces of code. So his name comes up in lots of places. So, for example, even in Hashcash, I had a version 0 with a different format, and Hal Finney and another person independently suggested to use the leading 0 thing, which is common in Bitcoin now, as a way to sort of optimize it very slightly and simplify. And so I made that change a few years later. But that, I guess, indirectly became part of Bitcoin, because evidently Satoshi looked at the paper and used the simplified version of it, which was Hal Finney's. And then he also made RPow. So, we talk about B-Money and Bitgold, but they weren't implemented. They were kind of protocol ideas for decentralized mining-based electronic cash systems, sort of Bitcoin precursors. But Hal Finney actually implemented RPow, which is less well known. It stands for reusable proof of work. And so it was centralized still. It was actually a Chorm server operating, so it had cryptographic blinding, so strong privacy, and it was operating in a tamper-resistant PCI card, basically, so an embedded computer. And you would send it proof of work, and it would send you blind coins that you could then respend. But it was centralized. So anyway, he also did that. And I think with Bitcoin, he was somebody to, pick things up and try them out and write a kind of field report. So he did that with Bitcoin. He reported some bugs, tried it out, wrote up his summary of how it works and the limitations and possible improvements, so that kind of thing. He did that for a lot of different things. He wrote about the cut and choose offline electronic cash protocol back in the 90s. He was involved in a lot of these conversations over time, and so his name pops up in a number of different places. He was also the first person to implement an encrypted remailer, so a way to send anonymous email. There were previous ones which weren't encrypted, but he combined it with PGP and so made the first encrypted one. So, and he was quite interested in applied cryptography and implementing and thinking about how to use different crypto papers to improve privacy for any of these cypherpunk projects to do with encrypt anonymous remailers or electronic cash or anything that was going. So yeah.
Right. We made this project called To the Moon, and when we were covering the early days of it, we did talk to Amir Taki, who provided he was a contributor early on in Bitcoin, but also provided the first BIP. And one thing he said, as a C++ programmer himself, he was saying that Satoshi's code is actually pretty bad, and that Bitcoin still, there are it'll always be there in the code. But do you see that? I know you have a PhD in computer science. What is the actual integrity of the code, like the early code, and that you had to build around some of his mistakes?
Well, I mean, I didn't make any code changes myself. I mean, I looked through the code and read somebody had written a guide to the code, so sort of a blueprint of how it fit together and all the different subsystems. So I read that to get familiar with how it worked internally, at least the code layout. The algorithm is, the actual network protocol and so on, you can understand without knowing the code organization. And I mean, so I don't know, I wouldn't presume to be to judge somebody's coding style, but I would say that coding style is, it's a matter of opinion. So one person might say that's ugly code, somebody else might choose to differ. And I have seen other developers, I think Greg Maxwell, for example, says that actually the code is pretty good. It has a low defect rate. So everybody's a critic. So I don't know. Maybe the code is all right. Of course, a lot of it has been refactored and improved incrementally over the years. I think people have the impression that Bitcoin was released and then people ran it, but actually it was optimized. Lots of different subsystems were enormously optimized over the original. So while the original could technically run still and sync, it's very slow, like orders of magnitude slower than the current version. So I think there's been a lot of refactoring and improvements that are sort of practical in nature while keeping the behavior, and then also this sort of so-called soft forks, so opt-in enhancements, basically.
Yeah, I understand there are a few sort of things that have come off patent recently, like Schnorr signatures, but also Peter Whale was tweeting today about U.S. patent number 7110538 have expired. So there were some things that were not able to be introduced in the early days, right, because of patents.
Yeah. Well, I think that's definitely true for, Bitcoin, the original Bitcoin used a library, so it didn't implement its own cryptography, and so it just used what the library used, kind of called high-level functions. But there was a project started, which is the libsecp 256k1 library. So that's just the name of the crypto standard. But they wanted to optimize and improve the library, and were able to ultimately remove Bitcoin's reliance on the OpenSSL library, which is probably a good thing. It's a kind of complicated piece of code. So I think at this point, that library is the kind of de facto go-to library for any use, even outside of crypto, for that signature algorithm. And apparently that was also first started in order to use this GLV patent that you mentioned, that is now expired. And so that appears to give about a 40% improvement in CPU efficiency for verifying signatures. And that was patented. So it shows that patents are kind of an annoyance. The people that patented it, I doubt, that they particularly made any money from doing that, but they prevented use of an optimization for many years. Schnorr itself was actually coincidentally expired, I think, just before Bitcoin was released. So Bitcoin could have used it, but I think the thing is, it's the reason, in my opinion, the ECDSA and DSA got used at all was to work around the Schnorr patent. So consequently, a lot of open source software was using ECDSA, and I think that Satoshi just used what was available in the library and space efficient. So that's why it would be a natural choice to use ECDSA, because to implement your own library is some undertaking in itself.
Okay, we only have,
that's been done now.
Yeah, we only have a few seconds left, and I just want to quickly say, because you did invent Hashcash, and we have a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. What does cash mean? Because this has become a big bone of contention and a very hot political topic these days. So what did cash mean to the cypherpunks back then?
Well, I mean, if you've ever bought a house and you've been in a position where you didn't need a mortgage, you would say you're a cash buyer. It doesn't mean you turn up with a suitcase of cash. It means you have the money and you can wire it immediately. So I think it means more like, kind of a bearer kind of asset that doesn't involve financial institutions as such.
Yeah, so it's not. It doesn't mean Visa and MasterCard.
No, right.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry for these technical issues, and I hope everybody in the audience enjoyed this fireside chat with Adam Back. And we have to exit stage left.